Now, the reaction to my post on protectionism is something that I kind of expected, because I know how I used to view protectionism as something really old and really stupid and really dumb. Um, I mean, if Paul Krugman and the Austrians can agree on something, then that obviously settles that deal, right? If even Paul Krugman understands the superiority of free trade, then only a complete, super duper double plus moron can support protectionism. And of course, when I say supporting protectionism, I'm talking about protectionism not as a general good thing, but in specific instances, and that's the way it was actually used. For example, in Britain to actually develop their well, at the very beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, of the textile industry. Britain was a wool producer, was naturally a wool producer, and what would happen is Britain would export wool to Flanders, the Flanders region. They would convert the wool into textiles, and then they would sell it back to Britain, at higher prices. And of course, Britain couldn't afford all of the textiles that had been turned into that came from their wool, and so the wool would go from Britain to Flanders, and then Flanders would sell the textiles all around the world and make a bunch of profit doing so. Right? And so what the British government started to do around 1700, and they also did this with Indian, well, I'll get into that later. They erected tariffs on textiles from all over the world, and later on they started doing it with tariffs on textiles in India. And the reason they needed to do this was because the British textile industry didn't have the economies of scale that the Flemish had. So even though they had to ship British textiles across the Strait of Dover to Flanders, there's an extra cost in that. Also, there's extra costs in certain wool producing regions further north in Britain, up around the Sunderland area. That's also a cost. Whereas if you have textile manufactories all around Britain, there's less overland transport costs as well, along with the transport costs across the sea. So there's a certain logistical advantage to having the manufactories in Britain, but of course these logistical advantages didn't matter because the Flemish were just better at doing it. Right? They're better at doing it. They've been doing it longer, and they had more efficient methods of doing so. And so it took time for the British to develop those methods, and eventually they no longer needed the tariffs once they developed their industries for textiles. And that's of course what you see. There was a period from about 1700 to 1850 in Britain where they had large tariffs, and of course this was the period in which Britain became the workshop of the world. They had tariffs. I have to look this up. But they had all throughout this period. I'll just tell you this: they had tariffs higher than that of any country other than the United States. And in fact, the U.S. and Britain, from the period 1700 to 1850, had tariffs highest in the world. And the United States continued to have tariffs. And Britain, around 1860, started to move towards free trade. The Corn Laws were one example, but the Corn Laws actually weren't that important. The more important thing was British reduction of tariffs on manufactured goods, right? Because the British model was basically to have high tariffs on manufactured goods from other countries. They would have no tariffs on natural resources, right? Because the idea was they would import resources from other countries, produce those, and then and manufacture those into something else, and then sell those things all over the world and make a tidy profit by doing so. That was their idea. So the British government had massive tariffs on manufactured goods, but no tariffs on raw materials. And that's also part of the reason for the British Empire, was that they could have a bunch of countries that Britain could dictate their trade policies in order to prevent retaliatory tariffs. Right? They could tell India that you're going to send resources to Britain. Britain is going to have protected tariffs on their manufacturing goods, but you can't have protective tariffs on your manufacturing goods. Right? So you can't develop infant industries in the way Britain did. Okay, and so that was the kind of the exploitative economic arrangement that Britain had. Right? Britain was allowed to have tariffs for their manufacturing industries, while India was not, and as a result, India was not able to industrialize. That was the exploitation. And this was commonly understood at the time. This was an explicit policy of the British Empire, and it worked. Right? British did not want the Indians to manufacture their own cloth. Right? And in order to do so, they did not allow India to have protective tariffs on a textile industry, and so a textile industry was not able to form like it had in Britain. When Britain was in a similar situation in the mid to late 1600s relative to Flanders, right? What Flanders had done to Britain, take their wool and produce textiles and sell those textiles all around the world. That's what Britain was now doing with India, right? They were taking India's cotton, producing textiles and selling those textiles around the world, right? But so that did in fact happen, and that's right. India was suffering under free trade, right? That was the exploitative nature of the free trade. So, okay. Now, Britain's relative economic decline really began in earnest around 1860, and this coincides with Britain's move towards free trade policies. There's a period between 1860 and 1932 where Britain was heavily free trade. In 1932, they reintroduced some tariffs, but then began to dip down back into free trade policy again. And this coincided with Britain's basically no longer being the workshop of the world. Okay. Now, I believe that had Britain maintained the protective tariffs, it would have happened it was already starting to happen, right? Because Britain naturally, by dint of their natural resources and the genetic makeup of Britons, was no better than France or Germany, on a per capita basis. So, I mean, the British preeminence was a bit unnatural anyway, and so you were going to see and you already were seeing some convergence effects. It was just it was just a result of Britain industrializing first. So, I'm not saying that the decline that coincided with the free trade policy, I'm not going to say that was caused by the free trade policy, but I'm simply saying that Britain did not Britain was not a free trade, right? And I'm going to have some links on this. There was an excellent little writing, a little publication. I forget what it was called. It compared Britain and France, right? You have the myth of protectionist France and free trade Britain. The exact opposite was true by a very, very wide margin. Why people continue to have this belief in free trade Britain and free trade the U.S. Is beyond me. Now, what's probably more the case is that the domestic markets within Britain and the United States were far more liberal, i.e. in terms of economic freedom, than continental Europe. That's something that I don't know for sure. that may be another myth, but that's something that is much more believable. And my suspicion is that because the internal markets of Britain and the U.S. were more free than France and Germany, that people tended to assume that France and Germany's trade policies were also more restrictive than Britain and France. When in fact, Britain, or excuse me, when in fact Britain and the U.S. Had far greater levels of protectionism. In the United States, already talked a little bit about that. You can go to the Wikipedia page. In fact, Wikipedia talks about tariffs in the United States. Just for some data points that are kind of interesting. Here we have 1920. Oh, excuse me. Here we have 1918. That's during the war years, so maybe you could say. Well, actually, no. 1917, 16, 17 is a bit lower. So you have, say, here's 1916. Average tariff is 8.9%, 1917, 7.7%, and then in 1918, the average tariff is 31.2%. In 1920, it's down to 16.8%. Okay? And then 1925 is 13%, 1928 is 13.8%. In 1930, you had the Smoot-Hawley tariff. The tariff jumped up again to 19.2%. Right? And so you could say, oh, that tariff has crippled the economy or something. Well, okay, 1820, tariffs were 20.2%. 1825, 22.3%. 1830, 35%. Okay, we go to 1845, 24.3%. 1850, 22.9%. 1855, 20.6%. All higher than the tariffs under Smoot-Hawley. And this is a period, and this was the period of the United States catching up to Great Britain in industrial capacity, right? Which the United States was always going to do eventually because of their greater size and basically their greater size, right? Their greater land mass and immigrants coming to the United States to fill out the land mass to get farmland, natural resources, right? Just the larger organic size of the United States, it was eventually going to pass Britain in industrial capacity, and this was the period in which it was doing. And all throughout this period, it had higher tariffs than it had in the Smoot-Hawley days, right? So now, I'm not saying that those tariffs caused, the industrial convergence of the United States to Britain, okay? But it's certainly like what I'm saying here is that the United States and the United Kingdom did not industrialize in a regime of free trade. The creation of industrial life as we know it, going from not having the steam engine to having the steam engine and railroads and factories and mass-produced goods, right, which created industrial life as we know it, where you're not grinding out a existence that's literally, in the year 1700, you look at the technology that they had, it was all stuff that any individual could make. Like, you could make gunpowder, you could make, well, probably couldn't make, but you could, but all the technology in the year 1700 was of such a simple extent that any individual could understand it and reasonably build it in time, right? They were literally, 3 or 4 steps above, caveman days. They weren't that far removed from caveman life. Okay, that's something that, anyway. So the creation of industrial life as we know it came about in a regime, in a non-free trade regime, heavily non-free trade. And countries that Britain blew by in terms of industrialization, and Britain and the United States blew by in terms of industrial capacity, all had more liberal trade policies than Britain and the United States, like empirically. Okay, so that's just something to think about. Sweden, for example, from the year 1870, Sweden was kind of a latecomer to the whole industrialization craze, far after Britain and after the United States. Their industrialization model was similar to that of Japan, in that they had a lot of public-private partnerships. and the main railroads in Sweden, for example, Eastern and Western, and the rail line from Luleå to Narvik, were all financed by the state, and they were all generally credited to helping the development of industry. Right? There's some central planning that helped the development of industry in Sweden. And also Sweden, another thing Sweden did to help the development of domestic industry was they had high tariffs. Tariffs on manufacturing goods, not as high as the United States and Britain for the data that I have. Find the tariffs right. Something here. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to have a ton of reading material in the description. Here we go. Average tariff rate on manufactured good for selected developed countries in early stages of development. Look at Sweden, 1875, it's only 3 to 5%, but by 1913 it's up to 20%. Right, 1925 goes down to 16%, 1931 it goes up to 21%. So not as high as the U.S. Of course, Britain by this time had adopted 0% tariffs on industrial manufactured goods. Britain had basically adopted a free trade regimen by then. Of course, Britain was pretty late in its industrialization, whereas Sweden was closer to just starting. So, yeah, and my belief is that, and the belief of the Swedes was that this protectionism enabled the development of Swedish industry. Industrialization in Sweden did not occur prior to two things. The Swedish government creating a lot of private-public partnerships, right, funded by tax revenue, right? They would tax and they would invest in these things, right? They would take money from the general public, which was not particularly rich. It was pre-industrial, not entirely pre-industrial. And they would create various public-private partnerships for, manufacturing and resource extraction industries and the timber industries. Okay, and they would protect these industries with a wall of tariffs against competing manufacturing goods, right? And it was this, and it was after this that Sweden began to have an industrialized standard of living. And there's a PDF that I found. Let me see if I still have it open here. Yeah, it's entitled "The Rise and Fall of the Swedish Model." It shows a pretty, marked increase. For example, in the year 1845, the reading capability of Swedes was only 60.8%. So 39% of Swedes were illiterate in the year 1845. Right. Of course, Britain, by this point, I think literacy was probably in like 95% or something. That's probably wrong. Someone's going to bring that up. But anyway, it was during this period where Sweden followed these illiberal trade policies and illiberal domestic economic policies that Sweden industrialized. And you could say, well, Sweden would have industrialized anyway. Well, but they weren't, right? Back when Sweden had a lower tariff, Sweden was not industrializing. Okay, and now maybe you could say Sweden's domestic economy was so unfree, and it was difficult to acquire land or difficult to basically build a factory in Sweden, and that's why Sweden was not industrializing prior to all this heavy state activity to basically spur industrialization in Sweden. Right, you could say that maybe. I'd want to look into it. I'd want to see why didn't Sweden industrialize until they started all these state private-public initiatives to industrialize, beginning around 1870. Right, I'd want to see. Japan is another example of a country that industrialized in a not free trade system. 1911. When was the year that the unequal treaty ended? Japan was prevented. I believe it was 1911. I'll have to find it. That they weren't allowed to have a tariff higher than 7%, right? Um, yeah, soon after it was forced open by the Americans in 1853, Japan's feudal political order, blah, 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 blah. Until 1911, Japan was not able to use tariff protection due to the unequal treaties that barred it from having tariff rates over 5%. Right? And of course, the reason that the United States didn't want Japan to have tariffs over 5% was because they didn't want Japan to be able to protect its infant industries, right? That as the United States had. That's how the United States industrialized. The United States had massive tariffs, right, on manufacturing goods especially. What the statistics I pointed out beforehand from Wikipedia, that was total tariffs, but U.S. tariffs were even higher on manufacturing goods. For example, let me see if I can see it here. Where was it? Where was it? What was it? It was go up here. Yeah, tariffs on manufacturing goods in the United States. 1820, 35 to 45% tariff. 1875, 40 to 50% tariff. 1913, 44% tariff. 1925, 37% tariff. So, on manufactured goods. So the United States was having tariffs on manufactured goods around 40%, at least as early as 1820. Although you can't get much earlier than 1820 because by then you're getting into the 1700s. You're getting close to 1776 when the U.S. was actually founded. So the U.S. did not have a free trade policy when it industrialized, and the people in the U.S. at the time believed that protectionism helped develop domestic U.S. industry, right, from British imports. Okay, the United States in their treaty with Japan, their gunboat diplomacy with Japan, said that the Japanese could not have a tariff over 5% for fear that Japan would develop their infant industries, which could then compete with U.S. industries. Okay. Moreover, by 1911, the Japanese were able to use tariff policies, and so that's what they did. Now, before being able to use tariff policies, what the Japanese would do is they would subsidize domestic industries. Right? They would subsidize domestic, the zaibatsus, as we've heard, which were public-private partnerships. Japanese government, what they would do is they would tax the general populace, and the Japanese actually taxed the general populace to such an extent that there were riots that had to be put down by soldiers. This is kind of similar to what the Soviets did by seizing the grain from the peasants to buy industrial machinery from abroad so that Russia could industrialize. So the Soviet Union did kind of the same thing. And they formed and the Japanese basically subsidized domestic Japanese industry, and this industry was able to compete with foreign industry. In spite of only having a 5% tariff, they were able to compete with more established, adult, grown-up U.S. industry. First off, they had the Pacific Ocean, which was kind of a trade barrier, which made, and so domestic industries had that as an advantage. Plus, they had a 5% tariff. Plus, they were getting some subsidies from the government. And with all these things together, domestic Japanese industry was able to develop. Of course, by 1911, the Japanese were able to have their own, able to raise their tariffs even further, at which point they did, and the result was a much more spectacular rise of Japan following Japanese industry following 1911. And another thing, and this is kind of a different thing, you see similar stories in Germany. France, even though they had less protection than the UK, had tariffs on manufactured goods running around 20% when they did. A funny thing, France didn't really converge with the United Kingdom in per capita GDP until around the 1960s. Mid-1960s, 1970s was when the French finally caught up to the United Kingdom in per capita income, per capita GDP, and manufacturing efficiency. This was not during a free market period of French. This was during kind of the post World War II rise of private public partnership and state involvement and state spurring of French industry and education. But that's another topic for another time. Another thing you had in Britain and in Germany, not in the United States, you didn't have this in the United States, but in Britain and Germany, and you had in Japan, was regulation of quality. Regulation of quality. And this is where, and the fact that the United States didn't do this and was fine is evidence that this may not be necessary. This probably wasn't a necessary thing. But in Germany, for example, several industrial conglomerates got together, and I believe they went to Congress or whatever and set up industrial standards. These were standards that the companies had to have. These were standardized production metrics, and this made production more efficient, more standardized. And there was a certain quality standard that companies would have to meet, lest German products get a bad reputation. Because that was a problem in Germany early on. I mean, we don't think about it now, but early on, Germans were actually biased against German products. They preferred English products because English products were more efficient, were better than shoddy German products. You know, shoddy German products. Right? A different time. Right? And there's also stereotypes of the lazy German, but that's another thing. So, and you saw a similar thing in Britain and a similar thing in Japan, where you had regulations on industrial standards. You didn't have this in the United States. And because you didn't have it in the United States, I don't know if you had it in Canada or not. But because you didn't have these industrial standards in the United States, and the United States obviously did just fine without them, it seems to be evidence that they were not necessary and they didn't really help. Maybe because German products had kind of a bad rap, that it's a remedial thing, that you needed to have these industrial standards. In order that that people in other countries would buy German goods otherwise, whereas the United States, because their goods had, for whatever reason, and this gets into another complicated area, for whatever reason, the United States never had the problem of having perception of poor quality, whereas German products did. The Germans needed this sort of remedial behavior to standardize their production and have higher quality production. And this led to German production being of such a high quality that that the Germans ended up producing. That the reputation, at least, was that Germans produced better products than the English, than the British. I think British products now actually have a worse rap than German products. But anyway, that's something that I'm doing. And I'm. This may seem a bit crappy to a lot of people who haven't been, like, for me, my movement away from libertarian certainty, I'll say, has happened over like the past 6 months, a little bit more than that, and so for some people it's a bit of a shocker, because I'm laying it out all at once, whereas for me, it's kind of like I've been doing this for a while. And, it's a bit difficult because, I've wasted a lot of time not learning real economics. I mean, that's a really mean way of saying it, but that's kind of true. I've spent such a long time, in kind of like in libertarian certainty land, that I'm actually going out learning real economics, and it's like, God damn, I wasted a lot of time, not learning things. having my economic views pre-digested from one of the sources that's in my ideological camp. I'm trying to piece together some sort of economic model that explains the industrialization of countries around the world. Anyway, the point being here is that none of the big industrial powers of the world today industrialized without protectionism. Now, you can sit here and say, well, the United States would have industrialized just as well, perhaps better, if it didn't have all of the protectionism. Or you could say, well, certainly it would have industrialized better because free trade is always good for every country, every time. Right? Libertarian certainty, free trade is good for every individual country in every instance. Right? And you could say that, but you could say that, but I know you don't know. I know it's just like a iron syllogisms for you, and I'm not interested in the iron syllogism and the deductive stuff. I'm interested in the real world, and the real world is messy as fuck. It's messy, and we don't know all the stuff that's going on, and I'm just moving away from the certainty. I'm not interested in your certainty anymore. Okay, I wanna explore the world now, and I like having an audience. And having an audience. One, it makes it more fun because people get to hear what I say and they say, "Wow, that's really interesting," and I get to, I like the butt pats and fart sniffing in that sense, but there's also a conversation that goes on. I like having a conversation, and I like and it's sort of a social thing as well. And I also like being an ideologue. I like advancing ideas, and I like convincing people of ideas. I think it's kind of a interesting thing to do. More and more, I've begun to learn that convincing isn't very flashy and mostly occurs behind the scenes. For example, there's this guy, and oftentimes you'll find yourself having convinced someone on something without having really even expected to, or without being totally pleased. For example, there's this guy on this forum, Left versus Right. I've been trying to convince him, all the wonders of racism, but he wouldn't listen. And then, for whatever reason, we talked about the Nazis and the Holocaust, and I started and I just made a few comments. I poked a few holes, saying, "Oh, remember the gas chambers in Dachau?" And then I mentioned, you can some introductory Holocaust denial. I put it in quotes, just kind of, there's no such thing as Holocaust denial. Revisionists are us, and apparently he's now talking about how the Holocaust didn't happen. There were labor camps. The numbers are way up, right? And so that really took hold with him. So I had all this effort on the existence of race and race differences, which is the important thing, and he managed to get convinced in like a day on the Holocaust revision stuff. So so a lot of the persuasion is not what you expect, or and it can surprise you what people get persuaded on, and so he got persuaded on the Holocaust stuff. Oh, wonderful! Like that's kind of like a minor, like who cares topic. My concern. It's something that I kind of beat around every once in a while, but it's not something I've ever deeply studied, aside from just reading a few books and watching, maybe if I had to estimate, probably about 20 hours of Holocaust revision propaganda, and that's what it is. It is propaganda. It is one-sided. That's what you have to recognize when you when you listen to any propaganda, it's going to be one-sided, and so you have to take that into account. And I've taken that into account. Some of the wilder revisionist claims anyway. But yeah, so that's just what I wanted to say. I just wanted to say that economics is a harder thing. And, I still think polycentric law can work. I still think polycentric law can work. I still think that I talk about private management of roads, for both the artery roads and the capillary roads as I divide them. And it's not roads are not a complicated thing. We have private capillary roads. We have private highways. They work just fine. We haven't seen a private highway system, that is totally private. Like, we haven't seen the whole shebang, all working together. That's true. So that would be a novel thing to have privatized roads on the scale that a polycentric legal order would require. But it's not. Should we think that that's a problem? I don't know why. We see it working on these small scales. Suddenly, now you're going from a private highway to a private capillary road. Do we know how to do that? We know how to do that. Do we know how to do that 10,000 times again? Copy, paste? I don't. So, I don't see that as... I don't even see that as necessarily a very daunting thing. Like, we know how to do it. Private roads are not a problem. But just my view of economics have gotten a lot messier, and what it really all came down to is my view that is the efficiency of markets, right? And how economic freedom definitely correlates to economic growth, but I've also been reading some things, and maybe I'll make a video some other time. But I've also been reading a lot of situations in which public enterprises and public investing beats out private investors. Okay, where public enterprises actually produce a product that's more profitable than private enterprises, where the public sector beats out the private sector, from time to time. And I've also, and I think people working for companies, and there's always the just so story that, this is not a completely free market, and so anything that reeks of market inefficiency, that's all a product of some sort of state intervention, and that's like this constant tape over, it's never the market's fault. Right? It's never the market's fault. It's always some sort of state intervention that's screwing it up. If you just had the pure market, then these problems would go away. Right? But of course, the boom and bust cycle from free banking, banks artificially expanding the money supply through fractional reserve banking, well, that's free market inflation, free market boom bust cycles. Well, there you go. There's that. It's not on anywhere approaching the scale of what happens with the Federal Reserve. But if you have no regulations on the money supply, well, you can get that fractional reserve banking, and people can do that. If I really cared to, I could find all sorts of examples of systematic market failures that can't plausibly be blamed. You can always find some sort of, because the state has its thumb in every pie. You can always find some link in any industry to the state, right? And because there's always a link, you can always find some sort of tenuous case that it's because of this link that there's this problem, right? But, and so it's frustrating. It's frustrating because the end result is this shield. You can never question the market in anything ever because, you know, the state is involved in absolutely every market activity, right? And because the state and because of that, right, it's tainted. It's like the one drop government rule that libertarians have. It's like, oh, well, that's not, you know, like if something produces something nice, like there's something efficient, like, oh, modern cars and computers or whatever, you know, that's the market doing that. Okay? But oh look, here's, you know, people buying these crappy overpriced processors when businesses could produce this more efficient, more easily, but they don't do it because somehow they make more money doing it this way and they're all doing it. Why isn't market competition preventing that? Oh, well, because the markets are not sufficiently competitive and it's too difficult for new businesses to form and break the de facto cartel, even though it's not even though they're not colluding formally, they're informally colluding, and it's a de facto cartel that causes this inefficiency to continue, that screws over the consumer, but it's not being broken because the markets are insufficiently competitive, right? And that's always what it is, right? The goodness from the market productivity is always the market, but the problem is always the state intervention, right? Or the state interventions or even they'll go so far as saying the state interventions in the economy in general prevents sufficient competitiveness. And it's just it's such it reminds me of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, right? Where Jared Diamond, you know, every piece of evidence is always used to support his thesis, which is, and I strawman to a degree, but not much. His thesis is environmental determinism, basically. It's all these little strips of everything is used to interpret. Everything is shoehorned into his like prism. Like there's no, you know, he ignores institutions basically. He certainly ignores any biological differences between groups of people, right? No, it's all environment and location. Right? You can't, and he'll even dismiss things such as the presence of, you know, cattle down in, anyway, such as the existence of domesticating, like when the Portuguese arrived in what is modern day South Africa, they came into contact with these African Bushmen people who were herding cattle in South Africa. And so they say, well, the reason, you know, Africa didn't industrialize or whatever is because they had lack of access to domesticatable but maybe they came too late or something. But of course, agriculture of rice, cultivation of rice existed in West Africa before any major agriculture existed in Europe. But I digress. It's just those stories. And it's really difficult because I know how libertarians view me, the apostate, because I know how I viewed apostates. I know that these criticisms, and you know what? My criticisms, they seem stupid because, well, it's not really criticisms, but I'm like talking about all this free trade stuff. But the thing is, like, because I have dropped the razor's edge efficiency view of markets, my criticism, like, because I've dropped that view of markets, I don't view markets as efficient as I used to. There's all sorts of implicit assumptions that get dropped. And it's been 6 months for me, and I've already dropped all those implicit assumptions. And when I held those assumptions, and like, for example, Spock was arguing for, government, run industry could beat out private industry. Private industry is more often beat out public industry, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not some iron law. Well, if you believe in the iron laws of market efficiency, blah, 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 you hold all these these implicit assumptions, you're going to think that's an absolutely retarded statement. But once you drop those assumptions, once the once the matrix falls from your eyes, and I don't mean matrix as in like that crappy movie, The Matrix. I mean like a matrix of economic bars that basically that say it's going to behave this way with certainty, and bam, we have certainty that it's going to be, if you have free trade, that your country's going to be better off, because while your auto industry is going to be eviscerated by the more efficient foreign competition, the people who were auto workers, they'll go do something else, and net productivity will be higher. It'll be Pareto efficient, right? So, and if you believe all those things, you're going to find someone talking. Like, for example, I do this analysis. I talk about like the protectionism and the development of British industries. I say, yeah, they had protectionist policies, and that allowed them to develop a textile industry, at which point it was no longer infant and then became mature, and then it was able to compete on the world market without the protections. Right? I say that quickly and easily, and to someone who still holds all the iron syllogisms, that seems retarded. That sounds retarded. That sounds like a really stupid thing to say, because there's so many things that I just don't know. And I just don't know the wonders of comparative advantage. I just don't know. I haven't read enough Mises books or something, right? I just don't know. But of course I did know. I did know it all. I knew it all better than most of you did. Okay, but the thing is, it's been time, and I've just dropped them. I mean, I've started to analyze the world, empirically, and they just became not useful. Like this libertarian bullshit just became not useful, and so I just kind of stopped using it, and I started developing more and more my own thing. Moving away from the Mises. Say the Mises cult, if you want to be really nasty about it, but as I moved more and more away from it, I started to develop my own thinking, and it's much more muddled. So anyway, I'll just stop.